The wind on that ridge knew Jonah's name. It was a high, lonesome sound, a sculptor of stone and patience, and it had been his only true neighbor for a decade. It scraped the silence clean, leaving behind the scent of sun-baked pine and the iron-rich tang of the earth. Here, the world was stripped to bone and sky, and a man's thoughts had nowhere to hide. Jonah's cabin clung to the spine of the ridge like a stubborn barnacle, its grayed timbers a testament to his exile. Below, the valley unspooled in a tapestry of muted greens and golds, a place he never entered. He could see the silver ribbon of the river, and on the far side, the faint, ghostly smudges of cook-fire smoke from the Ute village. He had ridden through that valley once, long ago, in a life that felt like another man's nightmare. He had worn a different uniform then, the kind of blue that promised order and delivered only gunpowder and ghosts. This morning, the air was different. It was sharp with the coming of a hard winter, but underneath, it carried a tremor, a wrongness that prickled the skin on his arms. His horse, a stoic gray gelding named Ghost, shifted in its small corral, ears swiveling toward the high rocks that serrated the skyline. Jonah set down his axe, his knuckles white on the worn handle. He scanned the familiar terrain, every gnarled pinyon, every slash of shadow. And then he saw it. A stain of color against the pale granite, a patch of darkness that did not belong. It was crumpled, still. A dead deer, perhaps, taken by a wolf. But the wind carried no scent of blood, only a deeper silence, as if the land itself were holding its breath. He took his rifle, not for aggression, but for the same reason a man takes a lantern into the dark. It was a tool against the unknown. He moved with a woodsman's quiet, his boots making no sound on the carpet of pine needles. The climb was steep, his breath pluming in the chill air. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself, not an animal. It was human, small. He found the boy lying at the base of a sheer rock face, his body twisted at an angle that defied nature. He was Ute. His deerskin leggings were torn, one leg bent beneath him at a sickening angle. His face, smeared with dirt and a fine tracery of blood from his hairline, was turned toward the vast, indifferent sky. He couldn't have been more than 12 winters old. Jonah's heart, a thing he thought had long since turned to stone, gave a hard, painful lurch. He knelt, the cold of the rock seeping through his worn trousers. The boy's chest was still. For a moment, Jonah thought he was too late, another ghost for this haunted ridge. He reached out a trembling hand, the one that still sometimes ached with the memory of a cavalry saber's grip, and pressed 2 fingers against the boy's neck. A flutter. Faint, erratic as a trapped moth, but there. The boy was alive. His skin was clammy, his lips tinged with blue. A deep gash ran along his scalp, the source of the blood, but it was the leg that was the true horror. The bone had broken through the skin, a shard of white gleaming grotesquely in the morning light. Shock and cold were killing him faster than the wound itself. Jonah looked down at the valley, at the distant smoke. He could leave the boy, ride down to the river, shout across, tell them one of theirs was hurt. They would come. They would see him, a white man, standing over their wounded child, and their grief would find an easy target. They would remember the blue coats. They would remember the fire. They would remember him, or he could do nothing, walk away. Let the wind and the cold finish their work. It was the law of this land, the harsh and unforgiving peace he had made. With his own damnation, he had no right to interfere. He had forfeited that right the day he'd watched a village burn and done nothing more than look away. The boy's eyelids flickered. His lips parted and a sound escaped, so soft it was almost part of the wind. A name, or a piece of one. A whisper of the tongue Jonah had heard in screams and wails, but never like this. It sounded like a prayer. Tae. The name was not meant for his ears. It was a sacred thing, a private agony. Hearing it was a trespass. And in that moment, the choice was no longer a choice. To walk away now would not be neutrality. It would be a final act of cruelty, a second turning away. He had already let one fire consume a people's hope. He would not let the cold consume this one small ember. With a groan that was part effort, part prayer, Jonah slid his arms beneath the boy's broken body. The child was impossibly light, a bundle of fragile bones and fading warmth. As he lifted him, the boy's head lolled against his shoulder. A small, unconscious act of trust that felt like a brand on Jonah's soul. He started the slow, agonizing journey back to the cabin, each step a negotiation with gravity and guilt. Above them, a lone red-tailed hawk circled, its cry sharp and piercing, a needle stitching the silence back together. It sounded like a verdict. The cabin was a cell for two ghosts. Its single room smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and now the metallic tang of blood and the faint, herbal scent of the poultice Jonah had mashed together from yarrow and willow bark. The boy lay on Jonah's own cot, the only soft place in the entire dwelling, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. His fever had begun to rise, a dry, dangerous heat that radiated from his skin. Jonah worked with a grim, focused desperation. He had set the leg as best he could, the memory of battlefield triage rising like bile in his throat. The snap of the bone being forced back into alignment had echoed in the small space, a sound of profound violence, yet the boy had not stirred, lost in the deep currents of shock. Jonah had bound it tight with strips of clean linen and splinted it with smooth planks of pine. He had cleaned the head wound, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle as he trimmed away the matted hair. He was no hero. This act was not born of righteousness, but of a deep and rotting shame. He looked at the boy's face, serene in its fevered state, and saw the faces of the others, the women and children in the village his unit had pacified. A decade ago, it had been a winter campaign, a reprisal for a raid he knew they hadn't committed. He remembered the commander, a man with eyes like chips of ice, giving the order. He remembered the smell of burning hides and the high, thin screams that the wind had carried away. Jonah hadn't fired his weapon. He had held his position at the edge of the skirmish line, his horse dancing nervously beneath him, and he had simply watched. He'd told himself it was protest, a refusal, but it was cowardice, a silent sin of omission. Later, they'd found him sitting alone by the frozen creek, his rifle clean, and cast him out. Not with a formal discharge, but with a shunning more absolute than any stockade. He was a man who wouldn't fight for his own kind, a man who had faltered. He had drifted west, seeking a solitude so complete it might scour him clean. He found this ridge, overlooking the very people he had wronged, a self-imposed penance where he had to see their smoke, their life, every single day. He had lost a child of his own, a son named Samuel, to a lung fever that had stolen his breath. In a single rattling night, Jonah's wife, Elspeth, had followed a year later, not from sickness, but from a silence that grew until it filled their home, their bed, and finally, her heart. He sometimes thought he could still feel the weight of her gaze, a look that didn't accuse, but simply wondered what had broken inside of him. The work he did now on the Ute boy, the gentle washing, the careful bandaging, it was a pantomime of the care he had failed to give his own family, a clumsy, belated apology to their ghosts. The boy began to mutter in his fever dreams. Ute. Words fragmented and urgent. Jonah laid a damp cloth on his forehead, and the boy's eyes shot open. They were dark, bottomless, and for a terrifying second, they were lucid. They held no fear, no gratitude, only an ancient, unsettling knowing. He stared at Jonah, not as a man, but as a feature of the landscape, a rock or a tree. Then he looked past him, toward the hearth where a low fire crackled. The boy stared at the flames as if he remembered them killing someone he loved. His breathing hitched. The focus in his eyes dissolved, replaced by the murky haze of fever. He turned his head away, a small, absolute rejection, and fell back into his restless sleep. The silence that followed was a physical presence. It was the clash of two histories, two wounds, trapped under one roof. Jonah's guilt and the boy's trauma circled each other like wary predators. Jonah found himself moving with exaggerated quiet, pouring a cup of water as if the sound might shatter the fragile truce. He sat in his hard-backed chair across the room, his rifle leaning against the wall, and watched the slow rise and fall of the blanket. He was the warden of this child's life and a prisoner of his own past, waiting for a dawn he knew would bring a reckoning. Days bled into one another, measured not by the sun, but by the rhythm of the boy's breathing. The fever raged, a forest fire in his small body, and Jonah fought it with the meager tools he possessed. He brewed teas from the precious bit of quinine he had left, forcing the bitter liquid between the boy's cracked lips. He made thin broth from a stringy rabbit, whispering pleas to a god he no longer believed in. He sang not hymns but the soft, tuneless ballads Elspeth had hummed while mending clothes, songs of lost love and green hills he would never see again. The melodies were ghosts in the cabin, meant for another child, another life. During his work, Jonah had found something tucked inside the boy's torn leggings. It was a soldier's coat button, brass and tarnished, bearing the eagle insignia of the U.S. Cavalry. His own unit. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through him. Had the boy been attacked by soldiers? Or had he found it, a relic of a past battle? Jonah couldn't know, but the object felt like a curse in his hand. He took it outside, dug a small hole in the frozen earth behind the cabin, and buried it. He packed the dirt down hard with his heel, a futile attempt to bury a history that was already clawing its way to the surface. On the fourth day, the fever broke. Jonah woke to find the boy watching him, his eyes clear and calm. The terrifying heat was gone, replaced by a profound, weary stillness. He accepted a cup of water, his hand steady as he held the tin cup. But he would not speak. He would not meet Jonah's gaze for more than a fleeting second. His silence was not empty. It was a wall, built of things Jonah could not begin to imagine. Later that afternoon, while Jonah was outside chopping wood, a sound from the cabin made him freeze. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching. He peered through the single dusty window pane. The boy had pushed himself up, his back against the wall. He had taken a piece of charcoal from the hearth and was drawing on the smooth, wide planks of the floor. It was not a child's idle doodle. The lines were deliberate, filled with a stark, innate artistry. He drew a mountain, its peak jagged and specific, the very peak that loomed over the southern edge of the valley. He drew a river, and beside it, a circle of teepees. Then he drew a horse, but it was strange, its legs too long, its head thrown back in a silent scream. And beside the horse, a man with hollow eyes. Jonah's blood ran cold. The drawing was a story, a map of memory. The next day, the boy began to hum. It was a low, guttural chant, a sound that seemed to come not from his throat, but from the earth itself. It was the same melody Jonah had heard in fragments during the boy's fever. It was hauntingly beautiful, and it was not for him. The boy was facing the door, his eyes half closed, humming toward the vast, empty wilderness outside. He was singing to someone who was listening. The feeling in the cabin shifted. The fragile reverence of healing gave way to an ominous tension. It was the quiet before a storm, the deep intake of breath before the thunder. Jonah knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that his time as a solitary ghost was over. He had touched something sacred, interfered with the story that had begun long before him, and the other characters were now on their way. He went about his chores, a man in a dream. He fed Ghost, his movements slow and deliberate. He checked the sky. It was a pale, washed-out gray, The wind had died down. The world was unnervingly still. He did not bring his rifle into the cabin. That night, he left it by the door, unloaded. Whatever was coming, it was not a thing a gun could answer. He sat in his chair and watched the boy, who had fallen asleep, the charcoal drawing a dark sigil on the floor between them. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of old promises and the terrible price of one act of grace. The Fedium. Light before sunrise was the color of a bruise. It was a thin, purpled gray that did not promise warmth, only exposure. Jonah was awake. He had not slept. He stood at the window, a tin cup of cold coffee in his hand, and watched the fog that had rolled up from the valley floor, blanketing the world in a soft, impenetrable white. Out of the fog, a shape emerged. A single rider, sitting motionless on his pony on the crest of the opposite hill. He was a silhouette, a sentinel carved from the morning gloom. He carried no weapon that Jonah could see. He simply sat and watched. Jonah's heart began a slow, heavy beat, a drum against his ribs. He felt the boy stir behind him, the soft rustle of the blanket. Then another shape appeared beside the first, and another, and another. They did not ride in a line or a formation. They simply materialized from the mist, 20 or more, fanning out in a silent crescent moon that faced his cabin. They were ghosts given form, their presence an immense, crushing weight. The land itself seemed to fall quiet. The birds did not sing, the wind did not stir. Every heartbeat was thunder in the oppressive silence. Finally, a figure appeared on foot, walking through the center of the silent riders. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his long hair braided with eagle feathers that hung to his waist. He wore a buffalo robe, and his face was a mask of stern, weathered dignity. This was a man who carried the history of his people in the lines around his eyes. The chief. He was not alone. At his side, her hand on his arm, was a woman. Her face was a study in contained grief, her eyes fixed on Jonah's cabin with an intensity that burned through the fog. And her other hand rested on the shoulder of a boy, her son, who watched with wide, solemn eyes. The chief, the woman, and the boy walked to the edge of the small clearing in front of Jonah's door. The riders remained on the hill, their power implied, their judgment held in reserve. The chief's gaze swept over the small cabin, the empty corral, the man standing silhouetted in the window. It was not a look of anger, but of assessment, as if he were reading every sin Jonah had ever committed in the grain of the wood he had used to build his home. The woman's eyes were different. They were searching for only one thing. Jonah saw the moment she saw him, a flicker of something in her expression, recognition, pain, a question she had carried for a decade. It was the woman from the creek, the one whose scream he still heard in his sleep. Jonah opened the cabin door. The cold air rushed in, smelling of damp earth and snow. He stepped out onto the porch, his hands open at his sides. He did not speak. There were no words he could offer that would carry any weight against the mountain of their history. The boy inside the cabin made a small sound. The woman's head snapped toward the door, her composure cracking for a single breathtaking moment. The chief raised a hand, a gesture of calm. His eyes, dark and piercing, found Jonah's. He spoke, and his voice was not loud, but it carried across the clearing with the authority of the stone and the wind. The words were English, learned for treaties and betrayals, and they fell like stones into the silence. "You have our boy." It was not a question. Jonah nodded once. The chief took another step forward. The woman beside him trembled, her knuckles white where she gripped his arm. "You touched one of ours," the chief said, and the words held. The weight of generations. It was the ultimate trespass, the ultimate entanglement. It meant everything that had been separate was now joined. Jonah's legs felt weak, his spine hollow. He thought of the rifle inside, of the world he had come from, a world that would have met this moment with gunpowder and shouts. He did none of those things. In the face of their immense, silent power, their history, their judgment, there was only one gesture that made sense. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to the frozen ground, dropping first to one knee, then to both. He bowed his head, his forehead nearly touching the cold earth. It was not an act of fear. It was an act of atonement, a surrender not to their power, but to their truth. He was a broken man on broken ground, before a people he had helped to break, and he was finally utterly out of excuses. The world was the sound of his own breathing and the hard-packed earth against his knees. Jonah did not look up. He waited for the blow, the arrow, the rough hands that would haul him to his feet for a summary justice he knew he deserved. He had played this moment out in his mind 1,000 times, and it had always ended in blood. But the blow never came. Instead, he heard the soft scuff of moccasins on the ground. A presence stood over him. He felt the weight of a gaze, ancient and heavy. "Get up," the chief's voice commanded. It was not angry, but impatient, as if Jonah's penance was an irrelevant delay to a more pressing matter. Jonah rose slowly, his joints protesting. He kept his eyes lowered, fixed on the intricate beadwork of the chief's moccasins. The woman, Pimia, had moved to the cabin door. She paused there, her hand on the frame, her breath a visible cloud in the frigid air, before disappearing inside. A moment later, a soft cry echoed from within, a sound of such profound relief and sorrow it seemed to pull the very air from Jonah's lungs. The chief, Acah, watched him, his face unreadable. "You are the man from the ridge, the one with the hollow eyes." It was not a question. Jonah's head snapped up, his heart seizing. How could he know that? The charcoal drawing on the floorboards. "The boy, my son Tafnopa," Acah said, gesturing toward the cabin, was not lost. He was on a vision quest, as his grandfathers were before him. The spirits guide the young to find their name, their path. His spirit guided him here. To you, Jonah could only stare, bewildered. Acah's eyes narrowed. 10 winters ago, the bluecoats came to our winter camp by the frozen creek. They came with fire and long knives. They killed my brother. They killed many. You were there. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Jonah staggered back. A step. He started, but his voice was dust. "Pimia, my brother's wife, saw you," Acah continued, his voice relentless. "She saw you on your horse on the edge of the killing. She saw the other soldiers shout at you. She saw you turn your face away. She thought you were a coward or a ghost." The shame was a hot, physical thing, crawling up Jonah's neck. It was true. All of it. He had been seen. His most private and damning failure had been witnessed. Tafnopa was obeyed then, wrapped on his mother's back as she ran. But the spirits remember. His vision was not of the future. It was of the past. He was shown a man on this ridge, a man whose soul carried a shadow from that day, a man who held a piece of our sorrow. His quest was to find you, to look upon the face of the man who watched his father die and did nothing. The first shocking twist landed, rearranging the world around Jonah. He hadn't rescued a boy who had fallen. He had been the destination of a sacred journey. The boy hadn't been saved by him. He had been sent to find him. The fall had been a mundane accident in the midst of a spiritual epic. The cabin door opened. Pimia emerged, supporting her son. Tafnopa was wrapped in the wool blanket, his splinted leg held stiffly before him. His eyes were clear and bright. He looked at Jonah, and for the first time there was no wall, no fever, no silence. There was only a deep, unnerving understanding. He had seen Jonah's soul in his vision, and now he was seeing the man. Pimia spoke in the Ute tongue, her voice soft but strong. One of the warriors who had dismounted and approached translated, his voice flat. She says you cleaned his wound, you set the bone. You kept the fire fever from claiming him. Akka nodded slowly. You fought for his life after you refused to fight for his father's. This was the reckoning. Not a trial of guilt or innocence, but a paradox, a knot of history and action that could not be easily untied. Then came the second twist, a revelation so profound it felt like the earth had split open at his feet. When the fever was high, Akka said, his gaze drilling into Jonah, Tafnopa spoke. He said he saw you in his dream. He saw you standing on this ridge, but you were not alone. You were standing between him and a great dying beast made of smoke and fire. The beast was the memory of the massacre. It was coming to consume him. But you stood in its path, and it could not pass. You were not a coward in his dream. You were a shield. Jonah stared, speechless. A shield? He, who had done nothing. He has seen a vision, Akka declared, his voice ringing with authority. Not of what you were, but of what you are. A man who carries the wound. A man who stands on the line between the living and the dead. This is your place. This is your nature. They were not here to punish him for his past. They were here because a child's sacred vision had declared his purpose. He wasn't a savior. He was a landmark, a piece of their spiritual geography. They weren't taking him. They were claiming him. They were asking for something he did not know he carried, the meaning of his own shame, the weight of his own survival. He looked at Pimia, at the grief etched into her face. He looked at Tafnopa, at the impossible wisdom in his young eyes. He dropped his gaze to his own hands, calloused and empty. He had begged for punishment in the silence of his own heart for a decade, and now they were giving him something far heavier. They were giving him a purpose born from his failure. The emotion of it was ancestral, mythic, a weight that crushed and remade him all at once. A fire was lit in the center of the clearing. Not a massive bonfire, but a small contained blaze of seasoned pinnon that crackled and spat, sending a column of white smoke straight up into the still gray air. The Ute warriors formed a wide, silent circle around it. Jonah was brought to stand within the circle, opposite Chief Akka. The cold ground felt charged beneath his feet, humming with a power he did not understand. This, he thought, is where it ends, a ceremony, a judgment. The drums began, a single high drum beaten with a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the heavy beat of his own heart. It was a sound that spoke of time, of the turning of seasons, and the memory of blood spilled on this very earth. To Jonah's ears, it sounded like a funeral dirge, his funeral. Pimia, holding her son's hand, walked toward the fire. Tafnopa moved with a slight limp, leaning on his mother for support, but his head was held high. He was no longer the broken child from the rocks. He was adorned. His face was painted with lines of charcoal and red ochre. A single hawk feather was tied in his dark hair. He was being prepared for something. Jonah's blood ran cold. Was this some kind of sacrifice? A ritual to cleanse the boy of his contact with a white man? A final, terrible rite to honor his father? His mind reeled with the half-understood, terrifying tales he'd heard from other settlers. He took a half-step forward, a protest forming on his lips. He would not let them harm the boy. He would offer himself. It was the only clean act left to him. My life for his, he croaked, the words tasting of ash. Aka's hand shot out, not to strike him, but to stop him. His grip was like iron. Be silent, he commanded. You are a witness, not an offering. This is not for death. This is for a name. Jonah froze, his confusion absolute. Pimia led Tafnopa to the side of the fire, and the boy looked across. The flames, directly at Jonah. Akka began to speak in the Ute language, his voice a powerful, resonant chant that rose and fell with the beat of the drum. He spoke of the ancestors, of the sacred mountains, of the ordeal of the vision quest. He spoke of the boy who had gone to the rock seeking a name and who had found a ghost. He recounted the story, the fall, the brokenness, the shelter in the hollow man's cabin. He spoke of the fever dream, of the beast of smoke and fire, and the silent guardian who stood in its path. Then he fell silent. He looked at his son. "The name you carried is now a child's name," he declared, his voice echoing in the clearing. "Today you are given your true name, earned by your spirit. You are Tafnopa, who walked to the edge of the spirit world. But you will be known to the people as Natyahait, he who found the hollow shield." The warriors around the circle murmured the name in unison, a low, respectful chorus. Nacha Ayat. Tafnopa Nasha Ayat dipped his head in acceptance. His trial was over. He had a name that would define his life, a story of survival and vision. Jonah thought the ceremony was over. He felt a wave of relief so profound it left him dizzy. But then Akka turned, his dark eyes fixing on Jonah. The drumbeat softened, becoming a low, expectant pulse. "The boy has his name," Akka said, his voice dropping. "But a story has two sides. A shield is nothing without the spear that it turns. His name is bound to you, the man who watched us burn, the man who saved our blood, the one who carries water and ash." He was not giving Jonah a name of honor. It was a title, a burden, a truth made manifest. It was not forgiveness. It was a binding. Pinya stepped forward, her face a mask of impenetrable sorrow and strength. She walked around the fire until she stood directly in front of Jonah. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, he did not look away. He let her see all of it, the shame, the regret, the hollow emptiness that the boy's vision had named so perfectly. Slowly she raised her hand. He flinched, expecting a blow, a final act of retribution for the death of her husband. But her hand was open. She placed it gently, not on his face, but on his bowed head. Her touch was not warm with forgiveness, nor cold with hate. It was heavy. It was the weight of her grief, her memory, her son's life. In that single silent gesture, she transferred the burden. It was no longer just his shame to carry. It was now their shared history. It was a moment that felt suspended in time. The entire world holding its breath. He was being marked, consecrated, and damned all at once. Akka spoke the final words, not to Jonah, but to the fire, to the spirits. "This one will not leave this ridge. He will remain. He is the guardian of this memory. He is the hollow shield. Let no harm come to him by our hand. His sentence is to live. His sentence is to remember." The ceremony was sacred, irreversible, and utterly beyond white comprehension. It was not a reward. It was not a punishment. It was an integration. They had taken his meaningless solitude and given it a terrible sacred purpose. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and one by one, the Ute vanished back into the fog as silently as they had come. Pimea took her son, Nacha Adet, and with a last long look at Jonah, a look that held a universe of unspoken complexities, she led him back toward the valley. Akka was the last to leave. He paused, his gaze meeting Jonah's across the clearing. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement not of friendship, but of a pact sealed in smoke and spirit. Then he too was gone. Jonah was alone again, but the silence was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the resonance of the drum, the weight of a name, the ghost of a touch on his head. He was no longer Jonah, the exile. He was the hollow shield, a man defined not by what he did, but by what he held at bay. He did not leave the ridge. The thought never even occurred to him. Where would he go? The world beyond this ring of mountains felt like a foreign country, a life. He was no longer equipped to live. His penance had been given a shape, a name, and a location. His life fell into a new rhythm, one dictated by the seasons and a profound, watchful solitude. He still farmed his small patch of earth, still tended to Ghost, but his actions were imbued with a new gravity. He was no longer hiding from the world. He was holding a post. He was a guardian, not of the Ute, but of an intersection point, a place where two histories had bled into one another and stained the ground. Years passed. His hair turned the color of the winter snow. His face became a map of the land weathered and creased by sun and wind. He rarely saw the Ute, but he knew they were there. Sometimes in the morning, he would find an offering at his cabin door. A brace of rabbits, cleaned and ready for the pot, a small bundle of dried herbs, a single, perfect eagle feather. They were not gifts of friendship. They were provisions for a watchman, acknowledgments of his duty. The children of the tribe grew up with the story of Nacha-Ayat, the boy who had found his name in the cabin of the hollow shield. Jonah became a figure of their myths, a strange, solitary spirit of the ridge, the quiet man who had turned back the beast of fire. One spring, when the river was swollen with meltwater, a group of trappers, rough men with greedy eyes, tried to cross onto Ute land. They made their way up the ridge, their loud voices and casual cruelties a violation of the deep silence. Jonah met them at the edge of his clearing. He stood before them, unarmed, his figure gaunt but unbroken. "This is not your path," he sighed, his voice rusty from disuse but clear and steady. They laughed at the old man. "Get out of our way, Grandad," their leader sneered, reaching to shove him aside. Before his hand could land, an arrow thrummed through the air and embedded itself in the dirt at the trapper's feet. They looked up. On the rocks above, silent and watchful, stood 3 Ute warriors, their bows drawn. Among them was a young man, tall and strong, his gaze unwavering. It was Nacha-Ayat. The trappers, seeing the silent promise of death in those drawn bows, scrambled back the way they came, their curses swallowed by the immense quiet. Jonah and Nacha-Ayat looked at each other across the distance. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The shield had held. Jonah lived out the rest of his days on that ridge, a living monument to a single moment of grace. When he finally died, it was in his sleep, the winter wind his only companion. A hunting party, led by Nacha-Ayat, found him days later. They did not bury him in the white man's way. They wrapped him in a buffalo robe and placed his body on a high scaffold on the very rocks where he had first found the boy, leaving him to the sky and the wind. Years later, long after the cabin had crumbled back into the earth, those who knew the story would look up at the ridge. They would point to the weathered stones where the scaffold once stood, and they would tell their children of the strange white man who had lived there, a ghost who had been given a sacred burden. His name was forgotten by his own people, but it was remembered by theirs, whispered not as a name, but as a description, a purpose, a legend carved into the canyon wall. Itself, he gave what the others never did: time and blood and silence.